All right, welcome to VCE Biology, everyone. This is the very first topic in Unit 1 Biology. So we're in the area of Study 1 in Unit 1, How do cells function? And it's from Chapter 1 in the textbook, which is Cell Structure and Function. Linking back to the study design, this is all about the dot point you can see here, where cells are the basic structural feature of life on Earth, and we need to be able to compare prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Here is the key learning intention, which is pretty similar to the study design. So you need to know that cells are the basic structure of life and that we can classify them into those two groups. So I want you to pause now, read through those success criteria carefully, and that's what you should be able to do at the end of this topic, at the end of this section. All right, so let's get started. Here's a whole range of species from around the world. And scientists think there are around 8 million species on Earth alive today, but we've only discovered about 1 million of them. So there's plenty more out there to find. Many of them are going extinct, and the problem is with climate change, if we continue to cause global warming at such a fast rate, we're going to cause a lot more extinctions, and we'll never even find or know about a whole lot of species before they go extinct. Another interesting thing is that living organisms can only live in these conditions. And it's one of the reasons why Earth is so unique, and it's why we're here. It's why life evolved. So you need an energy source, which is the sun on Earth. You need liquid water. You need the chemical building blocks, which includes a whole range of organic chemicals that can form naturally. And in particular, they include nitrogen, and carbon and oxygen, which are the key building blocks for making organic molecules. And you also need stable environmental conditions, or relatively stable. So we think that Earth, even in Melbourne, we think that we have cold winters and hot summers, but compared to other planets, our conditions are quite stable. And that's allowed life to evolve 3.5 billion years ago. All right, so this is the first key section that you need to know. What are the features that living things have? And a really good acronym to remember is Mrs. Grend. And this is the features that all living things tend to have. And you basically use it as a checklist. If an object ticks all of these letters in the acronym, then you know that it's living. So all living things can move in some way. Even plants move, even though they can't walk along or they can't change position. R stands for respiration. So every living thing does this process called respiration, where they convert their carbohydrates, which are just food molecules, which we eat as animals, and they convert that to a usable energy form. And ATP is the energy molecule in living things. Every living thing uses this amazing molecule of ATP to get energy, and all cells use it whenever they need energy. Living things also have sensitivity to stimuli. They can detect and respond to things in their environment. They can all grow, change their mass and add new cells, or they can make their cells bigger. Every living thing has to reproduce. If you don't produce offspring, your species will die out. And we would have died out long ago if no species could reproduce. E stands for excretion of wastes. So every living thing gets rid of dead cells or it gets rid of urine. Feces isn't waste technically. It's actually food that's never actually entered our body. It's never gone past our digestive system. So urine is technically the waste that we release. Nutrition. Every living thing needs to take in food or nutrients. Even plants that make their own carbohydrates in photosynthesis, they still need nutrients from the soil as well. And they need carbon dioxide from the air. D stands for DNA, which realistically is the most important one because every cell has DNA in its nucleus, and that is the molecule of life, essentially. So we've got Mrs. Grend, but the other final thing to remember is that every living thing is made of cells. and essentially if something is made of cells, it's alive. So you can use Mrs. Grand, but the idea of life being cellular is a much more simple way to define what's living and what's not. That's why viruses are normally considered not alive, because they're not cells, even though a virus ticks off most of Mrs. Grand. All right, the next section is about how big are cells. So we want to think about all the common units of measurement that we use. So the units that are common on our human scale, obviously kilometers and meters. Here's a meter, and centimeters and millimeters. So these are our human scale units that we're used to measuring in, but cells of course are much smaller, they're all microscopic. So we want to get used to measuring in micrometers, which uses the Greek letter mu, which is that symbol there, and nanometers, which is nm. So there are, if we're considering a millimeter, there are 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter, and there are 1,000 nanometers in a micrometer. Here's a few objects just so you can picture the scale. We have all the objects we're used to seeing. We've got some large cells, so human egg cells. Human egg cells here, you can see around about 200 micrometers. Common plant and animal cells range somewhere in here from 10 micrometers to 100 micrometers. And then when we get below that, particularly to nanometers, we're talking about viruses, and then we're talking about molecules themselves. And then finally, when we get right down to 1/10 of a nanometer, we're talking about atoms. Here's a table from the textbook that summarizes the common sizes of cells. And hopefully you can notice plant cells here, they can be up to 400 micrometers. Animal cells range from 10 to a bit over 100. And bacterial cells, which are prokaryotes, they only go up to about 5 micrometers, 5 microns. So hopefully you can see eukaryote cells are larger. And the common range for cells, if you're remembering some numbers, it's basically, if we round some numbers up, it's anywhere from 1 to 400 micrometers. Next is the cell theory. So here's a whole lot of scientists from the last 300 years. This is the very first microscope that was made by Robert Hooke, who was a Scottish scientist. And he was the first person to look through a microscope that functioned, and here are the cells that he saw. And he actually named them cells because he thought, oh, they look like boxes on a spreadsheet, or prison cells all lined up, which is what the word cell means. So since we first discovered cells, all these scientists in the last 300 years have come up with the idea of the cell theory. And it's based on all the observations that we've made in that time. And it consists of these 3 points. So all organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. Seems pretty obvious, but that applies to every living thing. The second point is cells are the basic structural and functional unit of organisms, which essentially that's the definition of what a cell is. And then number 3, all cells only come from pre-existing cells. Which then normally leads to the question, well, how did the first cell arise? And that breaks number 3, that breaks point 3, of course. There has to have been one original population of cells that first came into being. And there's been lots of experiments done in the past by scientists to try and model the early conditions on Earth. And we've almost got to producing a basic cell just from simple chemicals. All right, this is how we organize different cells. So we're starting to think about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. which are these two parts of the tree diagram. And the real key difference, there are a lot of differences, but the key difference is in the two boxes here. So prokaryotes don't have membrane-bound organelles. And we'll learn more about the details of organelles later, but essentially membrane-bound organelles are the larger and the more complex organelles. So prokaryotes don't have those. The whole prokaryotic cell is much more simple and only has a few simple organelles, whereas eukaryotes, they are larger and more complex, and they do have those membrane-bound organelles. And you can see here we're also splitting up into the 5 kingdoms of life that you would have first learned in year 7. So we've got 4 of the kingdoms, and bacteria is one of the 5 kingdoms that you used to learn. So we have protists, plants, fungi, and animals are all in the domain of eukaryota because they're eukaryotes. Here's a nice table summarizing the key differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but we'll highlight a few key points. Having a membrane-bound nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, that's exactly what I mentioned just before. So prokaryotes don't have them, eukaryotes do have them. We also talked about size earlier. So prokaryotes are much smaller, eukaryotes are larger. Anywhere from 10 even up to 400 micrometers like we saw earlier. Here's a visual diagram that compares the differences, so you don't need to know any of these organelles yet, but a lot will be familiar. I'll just point to the key differences again. So here's the eukaryotic cell on the left. It has a big nucleus with a membrane around it, even though it's a bit hard to see there. And it has all these large organelles, which have a membrane around them too. Whereas if we compare to the prokaryotic cell, there's no nucleus, and there's only a couple of simple organelles, cytoplasm and ribosomes. Next, cell shapes. So cells come in a variety of shapes. No two cells look alike. And in particular, the structure of cells matches their function, which is one of the big ideas in all of biology. We always want to consider what's the structure of something in a living thing. In other words, its physical shape or what it looks like. And we always want to consider what the function of something is. So what does it do? What it does. So for cells, their structure matches their function. And you can see in this diagram, there's a whole lot of cells here that have a particular job. We have neuron cells which send messages, and they have a long tail, a long axon to help them send those messages. We've also got skin cells, which are really flat, and they're joined together really tightly to make a nice waterproof barrier on the outside of our body. And we've also got muscle cells, which are really elongated because they, when we contract our muscles, they slide past each other horizontally, and that's what causes our muscles to move back and forth. Cells, that leads on to changing shape as well. So many cells can change shape. I mentioned muscle cells just before. We've also got one of our types of white blood cells in our body are called phagocytes. And these are basically like policemen that roam around the body, and they catch foreign objects in our body, and they can squeeze through other gaps in cells. They can move around, and when they find some bacteria or something foreign, they'll basically engulf it like a giant Pac-Man, catch the bacteria, absorb it, and break it all down. Some cells don't change shape, but they can still move around. So often it's unicellular organisms that are just made up of one cell, like this little like these two cells here actually. And there are two structures that cells can use to move around. They're called, the first type are called flagella, which this first cell here has. Flagella is the plural and flagellum is the singular. So here's a little flagellum at the back. Flagellum just looks like a long tail. And the flagellum whips along like a snake, or it spins around in a spiral like a propeller, and that pushes the cell forwards. So this little unicellular organism can swim through the pond using its flagellum. Flagella are not very common in animals and multicellular organisms, but in humans, sperm cells are the one type of cell that still have a flagellum, because obviously they need to swim so that they can fertilize an egg. The other structure that helps species and cells to move are called cilia, and they look like tiny little hairs on the outside of a cell. So this cell is called paramecium. It's a classical single-celled organism, and it's a protist. It's in kingdom Protista. They just live in ponds and freshwater environments, but it's covered in cilia. And the cilia just turn around in spirals like tiny little oars, and all of those oars spinning together provides enough force to push the little cell along so it can swim around.